Polish master Akiba Rubinstein is considered one of the strongest chess players who never became world champion. And in today's game, we will get a glimpse into just how brilliant he actually was. Played in Lodz in Poland in 1907, I think it's not much of a stretch to say that this is one of the greatest games in chess history, as you will see. So with the white pieces, we have a player named George Rotlewi, and with the black pieces, none other than Akiba Rubinstein. And the game starts with d4, d5, knight f3, e6, e3, c5, c4, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, and we are in the so-called semi-Tarrasch. I won't go too deep into opening theory in this game because what interests us is what happens later in the game. So we'll just keep going now. D takes c5, bishop comes out, a3, a6, b4, bishop goes back to d6, bishop b2. These are just developing moves, castles, queen d2, clearing the d1 square for the rook, queen e7. And it's actually worth mentioning in this position that black is sacrificing a pawn after c takes, e takes, knight takes, knight takes, queen takes. But after rook d8, there's a threat of bishop takes b4, so queen goes away, bishop comes out, and the position is considered approximately equal because although white is a pawn up, black has a significant lead in development. So equal chances. The game didn't go like this. Instead, white played bishop d3, and now after d takes, bishop takes b5, black gains the tempo and can get the bishop on c8 to b7. So bishop d3, rook d8, queen goes out of the way naturally. It's never good to have your queen on the same open file as an opponent's rook. And now the bishop comes to b7 and white castles. So now we can say that the opening part is over. Both sides have castled and both have developed their pieces. Black has maybe a slight lead though in development, and it's even his move. So now, how does black proceed? Well, he starts with a move knight e5 and threatening to double the pawns by taking on f3. So white takes, bishop takes, and this is maybe the first moment where white goes a little bit wrong with the move f4, and we'll see later in the game why that is. Better moves would have been moves like rook f d1 or h3, for example. But white played f4, and it is actually a little bit weakening for the white king, as we'll see later in the game. And now another mistake, white keeps pushing his pawns, e4, and that's also a mistake because now the g1 to a7 diagonal is going to become actually incredibly weak, and this will be one of black's main weapons in the game, which will be this g1 a7 diagonal for his bishop. After rook ac8, white continues to push his pawns, and all of these pawn moves are mistakes actually. After e5, white is actually already losing, and it's quite instructive in my opinion to see how black wins this game. First move is bishop b6 and check, king h1, and now quite a nice move, knight g4. Alright, so at first glance seems to be losing the knight, but after queen takes g4, there is the somewhat obvious rook takes d3, but it's not as simple as just winning the bishop on d3. White is actually in huge trouble here. So what is black's first and obvious threat? It is to take this rook twice, this knight, sorry, on c3. And what are white's options? Well, if he plays move like rook ac1 to defend it, then rook d2 is actually already winning because there is the threat of taking the bishop on b2, but there's also the threat to take on g2, and both threats just can't be stopped. So that won't work, and if in this position you try knight e2, then there is rook c2, again threatening the bishop on b2, and if you defend it, there are two ways to win. You could double the rooks on the second rank, and you can see that black is threatening both the bishop and the knight now, and there's no defense against that. But there is a more brilliant win that I want to show you after h5, and after takes, there is another brilliant move here. Bishop takes, g2 check, and after king takes, queen b7. You can see the trouble that white is in actually, because where does the king go? You can see how strong the bishop on b6 is, and you can see that the king actually has nowhere to go. So after rook f3, you've lost protection of the knight on e2, so rook takes e2 check, and after king g3, the moves just keep coming in with bishop f2, king g2. Now there is rook takes f3, queen takes, and bishop e1, and this is quite nasty because, well, what does white do? You have to move the king somewhere, and wherever you go, the queen falls, and there's just mate on g2 with the queen next move, no matter what white does. So that just won't work at all. And if we go back a little bit here, we had this move knight g4. This was a little bit about queen takes g4. What else could you try? If you try a move like, let's say, bishop takes h7 check, king takes, and queen takes g4, you might think you've won a pawn, and you have, but after rook d2, there is again the threat to take both on g2 and b2, which can't be stopped. So that doesn't work either. And he played bishop e4. I wanted to show you finally what happens if he plays knight e4, because it's quite pretty. The strongest move, according to the computer, is queen h4, but it's complicated, and I'm not gonna go into that. Instead, I want to show you a simpler win, which is rook takes d3, and this is just forced and easy to calculate. After queen takes, there is bishop takes e4, queen takes, and after queen h4, there is the threat of mate on h2, and it cannot be stopped actually, because, well, what do you do? There is only h3, but now there is the rather cute move queen g3, again threatening mate on h2. So what do? Well, you take the knight, but then queen goes back to h4, and this is checkmate. And you can see now, once again, how strong this bishop on b6 is. So be careful before moving your f-pawn. That has often been problematic in chess. It's also often been good, but just be careful when you move your f-pawn. You can regret it. So after this brilliant move, knight g4, white played bishop e4. We've looked at the other options. So now Rubinstein played queen h4, threatening mate in 1, and this gives white two options. There is h3 or g3. So after h3, there is, which he didn't do it, by the way. We'll get to g3, which he did in a moment. But first, if he had played h3, it's quite brilliant again, actually, because now there is rook takes c3. So if you take this, there is bishop takes. First, if queen takes e4, then there is again this motif that we saw before with queen g3 and queen back to h4 mate. So after queen takes g4, black can take, and rook d3. And the threat here is actually not just to take the bishop on c3, but also to go over to h3, which actually would be checkmate because the pawn on g2 is pinned. So that's why white has to play king h2, and now black has a winning position here. And if we rewind a little bit here, we had h3, rook takes c3. This was after bishop takes c3. If you play in this position queen takes g4, there is this brilliant move rook takes h3. And now white has two options again. You can take with the pawn or the queen. If you take with the pawn, then there is bishop takes e4, king h2, rook d2, and this is just game over. Rook f2. There is just a forced mate here. So where were we now? Rook takes h3. If you take with the queen, there is queen takes, g takes, bishop takes, e4 check, and then rook comes up again. And after king g3, you don't even have to take the bishop on b2 because you have rook g2 check, king h4, and now slightly unusual, bishop comes back to d8 to check, and now there is bishop g6 mate. So all of these lines are quite interesting. That's why I'm showing them. Where were we? We had he played h3. There was this brilliant move, rook takes c3. And we've looked at bishop takes rook, and we've looked at queen takes knight on g4. Then there is also, if he takes on b7, there is rook takes h3, another brilliant move. Pawn takes, queen takes, and the only move here is to block, but this is checkmate, so this wouldn't have worked. So if we go back to this position after queen h4, white had the option to play h3. He didn't, but had he done that, we would have seen one of these lines that I just showed. But in the game, white played g3, and now the most brilliant move in the game, which is rook takes c3. Just ignoring the fact that the pawn on g3 is attacking the black queen, and now white did in fact take the queen, but I want to show you that he is lost in any case. If he takes the rook, for example, there is bishop takes e4 and so forth. If you take, then there is checkmate like this. And if you play bishop takes b7, then there is rook takes g3. And so what could white do here? Let's say he plays, for example, rook f3. Then there is rook takes, bishop takes, and now knight f2 check. And this is actually winning. You have two options. You can play king g2, but then queen h3 check, king g1, knight e4, king h1, and knight g3 checkmate. It's a lot of lines here, and I think Rubinstein had seen probably all of them because that's just how good he was. After king g1, there is queen h3, and maybe not the most obvious move, but you'll see in a second why this is such a strong move. Play, for example, rook f1, there is knight e4, and there's just not much white can do here if you block. There is this brilliant move, rook d1 check, and takes, then there's take, and king h1 and knight g3 checkmate again, for example. These are just some of these quite brilliant lines that there are here. And for example, in this position after queen h3, if you play, let's say, rook c1, then there is rook d1 check, and rook takes, knight takes with a discovered check, king h1, knight comes back to f2 with a check. And now there is this same motif as before, knight e4, king h1, and knight g3 checkmates. So basically, it doesn't matter what white does, black always has something, and usually something brilliant at that. So let's rewind a little bit again. In the game we had this position after g3, and Rubinstein played rook takes c3, this brilliant move. We've looked at why taking on c3 doesn't work and why taking on b7 doesn't work. So finally, we'll look at g takes h4, which is what happened in the game. And Rubinstein just can't stop making brilliant moves because his next move here was rook to d2. And again, white has some options, as you can see. There's just so many pieces hanging, and he took the knight on g4. No, sorry, actually he took the rook. If he takes the knight, and the bishop is hanging, and you can see how amazingly strong the black bishops are, and there's not much white can do here. I have to block this somehow, and now after rook takes, there's just nothing white can do. If you take the rook, then bishop takes is checkmate, and the threat is rook f1 with a double check and a checkmate, so there's nothing to do here. So you can't take the knights, and if you take this rook, then there is, of course, rook takes e2, takes the queen, and the threat here is rook takes h2 checkmate, and what are you going to do to stop that? So what else do we have after rook d2, this brilliant move? You can't take the knight on g4, you can't take the rook on c3, and if you take the bishop on b7, there is rook takes, and again there's this threat to take on h2. And you might think that you have a defense here with bishop g2, but now there is the absolutely beautiful move rook h3, threatening rook takes h2 checkmate, and if you take that, then the other rook will take on h2 checkmate. So this is quite brilliant. So this is, if we go back to this position g3, we had rook takes c3, just leaving the queen on h4 to be taken, and it was taken. And then rook d2, and here white took this rook, and the next move is kind of obvious. White has a hanging piece, which you can take with check. Bishop takes e4 check, and now, well, there's not much to be done here because, well, you can't move the king, and the only legal moves is rook f3 and queen g2. And after queen g2, based on some lines that we just looked at, you might be able to guess black's next move. It's quite a nice one. It is rook h3. The threat is rook takes h2 checkmate. So here white resigned. If you take the bishop, then it's mate like this, and there's obviously not much to be done else. If you play, for example, rook f3, then black will just take, and then there is just no way to stop rook takes h2 checkmate. This game is known as Rubinstein's Immortal. It is a reference to the so-called Immortal game that was played by Adolf Anderssen in the 19th century. Having said that, I thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.